In my early 20s, I was a professional touring and recording musician with the quasi-medieval folk band Blythe Power. And during a particularly lengthy tour of Eastern Europe, we were booked to headline a music festival in Poland. Sitting backstage, eating our usual unappetizing meal of textured vegetable protein, baked beans and burnt onions, we could hear that every single band that was getting on stage was playing a kind of guttural, death thrash Eastern metal, death metal type music. And we were beginning to get worried. At the appointed hour, we ascended the stage armed only with acoustic guitars and a kind of folky deference to healthy life, to look at an audience that I can only suggest resembled the horde that assaulted the great bastion of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. I have never felt such bowel-emptying terror in my life until I stepped onto the stage a couple of minutes ago to fill in for Patrick Barkham. So it's really quite important that we go through together as a group the 7 stages of grief, Patrick Barkham. The first, shock and denial. You'll have achieved this when you walked in this morning and found out that I was speaking to you later on today. Learning this with a loss, numbed disbelief. You'll have moved on to stage 2, pain and guilt. Where the hell am I going to get the signature for my wife's birthday copy of Badgerland now? This is really tragic. March the 15th. God, what am I going to do? Then we move on to anger and bargaining. Who is Darren? I want my money back. I'm sure many people have left already. And we're on to stage 4, which is depression, reflection, loneliness. Many of you will know this because any mammal enthusiast who collects fecal matter in their spare time, you know, you've drifted seriously well away from what's socially acceptable. The upturn, lunch. Well, there you go. And so we're on to stage 6, reconstruction and working through. Perhaps Darren could sign my copy of Badgerlands by Patrick Barkham. Who knows? Only if you've got one of these first. And finally, stage 7, where I hope we are now, acceptance and hope. Darren stands in rivers. So does that lovely Mr. Barkham. Therefore, he must be jolly nice too. So we will listen to him after all. And I can tell you for a fact that I not only stand in rivers, but I also sit under trees. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Barkham. So here we are, nature conservation for waterfalls. Let's get on to the serious stuff. I won't take too long. Because I say I'm not allowed to say anything, apparently. But we've got to work out what we mean by sort of waterfall conservation and how it's helping our waterfalls. Now, we feel pretty smug in the eastern region, I think, because we are doing a lot of work for waterfalls. But we do have some really serious problems for this species still. We've got fragmentation of habitat, we've got habitat loss. These sorts of developments are obviously going to obliterate whatever is there, and the waterfalls are going to suffer as a consequence. And this insidious way that we use the planning system to work around species, so we will retain waterfalls on site now. We will design a wonderful housing estate which moves around a previously lovely little stream, but retains it, and we put in a buffer strip of 10 metres, and we think, well, that's fine, the waterfalls will stay there. But of course, 25 years later, all of those waterfalls have gone, the stream's as good as dead, and any bits that did actually look good at one time have been mown to a bowling green by local residents who don't like the untidiness of the water's edge. So that's a real issue for waterfalls still. We are obviously having a bit of a to-do with Trump over climate change. Obviously, they don't have it in America, but we are getting it here. So we do see these sorts of scenes along the Essex and the Suffolk coast of our seawalls being totally inadequate now to really hold back the waves. So this particular site did have waterfalls on it before the seawall was breached in 2013. It's now, by the way, a wonderful wetland site for Essex Wildlife Trust. Come and visit us if you wish. And we're also looking at a historic decline that many of us don't even know about. We're looking at water voles and thinking, well, they've declined by this or that over 30 years. Few of us realize that they were a terrestrial species up until the 1800s. They would have been widely spread through fields, nowhere near water. And most of these animals were trapped out, bounties were paid for them, and they were just basically culled as an agricultural pest. So we'd already lost a huge number of waterfowl by the time we got into the 20th century and started looking for the ones that still lived in the water. I had a wonderful visit up to Glasgow with the UK Waterfowl Steering Group last year, and we saw waterfowl living in the middle of a Glasgow housing estate. I mean, these are tough waterfowl, I can tell you. But there's no water in sight. There's literally vole hills dotted around all over this amenity grassland, and they're just living in there. So that's what we used to have. Predation, I tell you, I'm glad I couldn't put a video on this because it's a ghastly sight. Snuff videos, I don't like them. But waterfowl are naturally predated. We all know this. If in a normal, healthy environment, waterfowl will get picked off by, the herons, all the raptors, foxes, stoats, weasels, even pike are going to have a go. So we can accept that in a normal, safe, healthy environment. But what we have today is not that environment. It's an area that's fragmented, it's an area that's busy, it's an area where humans are interfering all the time. And so even natural predation could be the last nail in the coffin for a very small, isolated waterfowl colony. And that's before we get on to mink. And as I expect most of us in this room know, mink are a real problem now for waterfowls across the UK. They have literally wiped out around about, we think, 95% of waterfowls in a period of just sort of around about 40 or 50 years. And they have that ability to hunt the waterfowl below the waterline, above the waterline. Anywhere the waterfowl can go, the mink can follow. This is not the behavior of a polecat. It's not the behavior of a stoat or a weasel. They simply cannot protect themselves against this predator. So we've been trying our best to weave a way through this mire of bad news and come up with solutions, ways to work with waterfowls, ways to mitigate the effects that we as human beings have on them. And I was last here at the beginning of 2016, before the publication of this handbook, which we tried to get to grips with how we move waterfowls around in the countryside. There's a real feeling that we know what we're doing when we just pick up a population of animals and dump them somewhere else. And often, we don't. We're doing it in the wrong way. So new guidance we've been working on is now published. We're always looking to try and update this to allow development to happen, because it is going to happen whatever we do, but in a sensible way, not the way it's been done up until now. And yes, in the Eastern region, we have some good news. That very same year, we were featured in the State of Nature report as an exemplar of how you can enact landscape-scale conservation for a species. So the waterfowl here, this work is continuing across Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, London, Kent. We have a huge network of wildlife trusts and partners working together to get on top of this massive problem, all on a shoestring budget. I mean, £2,000 or £3,000 per county per year to do this sort of scale of work is incredibly challenging, but it can be done if you work at it. So I've always quoted, the start of that project really was when Penny at Suffolk Wildlife Trust was working on a Deben and trying to get a handle on what was going on there, because her surveys were showing a massive decline in waterfowl. And this was a time when the river habitat would not have changed to any great extent. And yet you went from 79% of sites being occupied to just under 50% in 6 years. That's a dramatic decline. And it was recognised at this stage that mink control would have to be a tool used for the conservation of waterfowls. And so that control went in, and the following year, waterfalls were back up to their former range. So we could see that there was a cause and effect here, something that we could do to make the environment a better place for waterfalls. Now, Suffolk Wildlife Trust are looking at a project that's going to study the data that's been collected for many years. And Simone Bullion's been working on this and will be during this year. And it will be fantastic for us to finally get the information in black and white that we can use to prove what we're doing is having an effect one way or another. We need to know, because as Martin has said before, evidence-based. We must be evidence-based in conservation. So we've been doing all sorts of things over here. We've been trying to work in ways that will be friendly to waterfalls. So when we've got a canal structure, which must be maintained, then we're going to use these sorts of methods, more natural bank building methods than the sheet piling or concrete that we would normally pour into a channel like that. And it can work. It can really make the environment a better place for waterfalls. So in a small scale, we're doing this, trying to make sure that what we do is waterfall friendly. We've been restoring rivers that previously had silted up and been bypassed by mill structures. So we're reconnecting habitat here. And we're looking at other novel methods. Reintroduction of waterfalls has a really patchy history. We've had some really spectacular failures at waterfall reintroduction across the UK, but we have learnt from that. We've learnt how to do it now, and we've had two of the most successful waterfall reintroductions in this region in the past 7 years at a very large catchment scale. So this can be done, but it is almost an admission of defeat to go down the reintroduction route. If you're doing that, you've basically said, well, it's got to such a parlous state that these animals can never come back on their own, so we're going to have to intervene. So it really is a last resort. Anyway, we're developing methods to monitor watervoles. Stig, the watervole tracking dog, has been very useful to us. He's been up and down the canals, searching those areas that humans simply cannot reach. And we've got the use of camera traps and all this other information gathering that we can do on the ground. And certainly on the Stork, where I was talking to the press earlier on this week about our report, we've noticed that the release at Thorley Wash, at the blue reserve up there, watervoles have spread quite happily down the interconnecting canal to our Sawbridgeworth Marsh and Rushy Mead reserves in the north and the south. So given the chance and given a safe environment, they will move around and they will recolonize, and you can reinvigorate a whole catchment once you've got on top of the issue of mink. Now, as we said, there will be a report launched on Monday, and hopefully most of you will hear some of that information when it comes out. I did ask for permission to go through some of the details, and I was told that Granty's here from East Anglian Daily Times. There's no chance it will stay secret till Monday. So unfortunately, I'm just going to have to be a bit broad brush. I can tell you it doesn't make pleasant reading. We set up the National Watervole Database and Mapping Project in 2009 with the hope that we would be proving that our conservation efforts had done such a sterling job that we no longer had to worry about watervoles. But it just doesn't seem to be the case. It's a very patchy result, and I do advise any of you to have a look at this information when it comes out. And it does pose that question. If we can't, with all these efforts and resources we've put in, and the fact that we've got a charismatic animal that everybody seems to love because of Wind in the Willows, if we can't protect a protected species, what species can we protect in the environment? We have to be cleverer than this. We, even as conservationists, assume that things will get worse, but that we can slow it down. No, we shouldn't be thinking like that. We've got to reverse this, and now is the time for that change. I'm not necessarily the biggest advocate of Brexit on the planet, I have to say, but we have an opportunity now to influence our lawmakers and make sure that we do not erode our environmental protections. So the government's got to stand up and actually do what it's saying it wants to do and create this national recovery network. We have to have a landscape that is good for farming and wildlife all at the same time, and that there's no priority of farming over wildlife. We also have to find space for this huge number of houses, which every single major political party bangs on about all the time. You know, a town the size of Colchester and Ipswich every year, it's got to go somewhere. So we've got to be very careful about what's going on with our environment in between. We need to work with our landowners because they can produce a happy medium, and a lot of them want to, and if they're incentivized to do so, they will. So that has got to be enshrined in the heart of everything we do. And we need to keep surveying. We've got to keep that information going into the national database. We've got to know in 10 years' time what has happened since Brexit, what has happened since we said we're going to do better than we're doing over the last 10 years. So we can achieve a lot together. And I'll just leave you with one final thought, touching on what Lizzie was talking about earlier on, really. I've spoken to a number of landowners that have been helping with the water vole recovery and the mink control project in northwest Essex. And that's an area where over the last 10 years we have seen a real rise in the number of polecats. Now, mink arrived at a time when they would never have encountered both otters and polecats. They'd never have encountered pine martens. We've got 2 of those native species back, 2 species to compete with invasive mink. And mink appear to be dropping in numbers in the northwest of Essex. And it's not trapping effort alone. We have a very sparse network in that part of the county, and yet polecats are being seen regularly and mink are not. Now, this is totally anecdotal. We're going to do much more research into the future, but could it be that the predator in the water that didn't manage to displace mink is just enough with the predator on land to do the job? Well, who knows? But in the meantime, we have to keep on fighting, and we have to keep publicising that these are issues that are barometers of what's happening to the environment as a whole. It's not just about water voles. Every species out there we're looking at declines, and we seem to be accepting it as acceptable, and it is not acceptable. So, thank you for the chance to speak to you without the ugliness that I endured that fateful night in Poland. I think I'm going to get out of here alive, and I guess I'll just have to send this to Patrick and get him to sign it and send it back to me. Thanks a lot.